the last thing they wanted was to give the revisionist right wing its big prize. Ha ha, we were right. You see, we were right after all.
That was today's guest, Michael Cucek, and we'll return to that conversation in just a moment. From Asia News Weekly, you're listening to Asia Now, a collection of stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. One of the most contentious issues facing Korea and Japan is that of the wartime use of women as sex slaves. But what happens when a major paper recants its stories? It's one conversation taking place in Asia now. Welcome to Asia Now. I'm Steve Miller. In the 1980s, the Asahi Shimbun reported without thorough investigation that Seiji Yoshida forcibly took local women from the South Korean island of Jeju to serve as comfort women, or as the United Nations refers to them as, enforced sex slaves. Quote, "We have judged that Mr. Yoshida's statement, in which he said that he took comfort women by force from Jeju Island, was fake, and we retract the article. At the time, we could not figure out that the statement was fake," wrote the Asahi Shimbun recently. What's the background on Seiji Yoshida's contribution to these Asahi Shimbun articles? And what's the effect of its retraction? Today I discuss that topic with Michael Cucek, an Adjunct Fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. He describes himself as being opinionated, disheveled, and a stick in the mud. But one thing he is most certainly not is incurious. Michael, welcome to Asia Now.
Thank you.
So if you could, please help us understand the role that Seiji Yoshida played in these Asahi Shimbun articles.
Seiji Yoshida was evidently a serial prevaricator who was a labor contractor working out of Yamaguchi Prefecture, the prefecture that's closest to the Korean peninsula. And he claimed that he was part of an expedition that grabbed women on the island of Jeju and took them away to become prostitutes in the prostitution system called the Yamfu system, the comfort women system of the Japanese military. He started talking about this in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The Asahi Shimbun and other publications quoted him as evidence that there was coercion, physical coercion, in the recruitment of women for this prostitution system. Unfortunately for Yoshida, historians and others began asking questions, specifically going to the island of Jeju-do and asking old people there, do you have any memory of these things happening? And they couldn't find any evidence. And Yoshida could not provide any physical evidence of his having done what he said he did. Now, during this time, he became quite a public figure. He went and apologized very publicly to comfort women. And this, of course, would also be covered by the news. So he was providing the news with these stories. Eventually, in the early 1990s, historians, both of the revisionist right and of the left, who were investigating the comfort women story as best they could, given it was very hard to get into government archives, both came to the conclusion that whatever Yoshida was saying, there was no way to use it as testimony. However, it was only until now that the Asahi Shimbun repudiated the content of the articles containing testimony by Yoshida.
Yeah, so why did it take so long for them to repudiate or retract these articles?
They chose in the mid-1990s to remain silent and to not talk about him anymore, and to simply, I guess, pretend that they hadn't done these things, even after other news organizations had repudiated the content. Why they chose to do so is possibly professional pride, because they were the most prominent publishers of his stories. Possibly they thought that if they conceded that Yoshida's coercion stories, his rounding up of women's stories, was not credible, that much of the good that was done by talking about the comfort women system would fall to pieces, because the obsession of the revisionist right, people like current Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, was with this concept that the military of Japan actually went and kidnapped women for service in the prostitution system. And they obsessed about that, and they kept talking about that. And that was the only thing that they talked about. The fact that the only clear testimony we have of that happening outside of Indonesia, where it is clear it did happen, was Yoshida's testimony about Jeju Island. So why now? The Asahi, in printing its retractions, did not explain why it chose August of 2014, but there are two possible, really likely scenarios. One is that Abe and his chief cabinet secretary, Mr. Suga, are longtime critics and opponents of the comfort women portrayal that is made in what's called the Kono Statement, which was made apologizing for the comfort women system. Nevertheless, now that they're both in power, Abe as prime minister, there really is nothing else that cements the relationship between South Korea and Japan. If the Abe cabinet were to repudiate the Kono Statement, there would never be a South Korea-Japan summit during Abe's tenure, and maybe not for quite some time after it. And they want to avoid that. So Abe has been meeting with the heads of newspapers, including the head of the Asahi Shimbun, frequently, and having dinner with them. And they may have come to some sort of quid pro quo regarding the Asahi's reporting and what the government response will be. The government response to these retractions has been nothing. Has said, oh, okay. It's been the opposition, it's been Abe's rivals within the LDP who have made the biggest noise about the Asahi Shimbun's actions.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask you, is that this is huge news, especially in light of Abe's opposition to Yoshida. He even called him a crook at one time.
That's right. He did that in the build-up to his running for the prime ministership, basically, in 2012. He certainly did that. And he set down the marker on the Yoshida testimony that it had to go, that it was a minimum level of honesty. What we have, though, is this exchange that the Abe administration and Abe personally has been put into the very uncomfortable position that he has to defend a statement that he's been denouncing for the past decade. But he has no choice. He's the leader of Japan, and Japan has no choice in this matter. The second possibility of why the Asahi Shimbun did this now is because this is the 69th anniversary of the end of World War II and the beginning of the country of South Korea and the beginning of that post-war history and this new identity politics that came with it. I can understand the Asahi wanting to clear the decks before the 70th anniversary year rolls in, because everybody wants the 70th anniversary year to be a year of reflection and not a year of fighting. And this clears off one of the really major stumbling blocks to working toward a 70th anniversary year. I mean, 70 years since the war is over. It's an eternity. It's a human lifetime, yes, but it seems an inordinate amount of time to be still talking about these issues. But that's where we are. I can understand the Asahi wanting to contribute to a better 70th anniversary.
Now, I have to ask, because of so much controversy around this issue, does the Asahi's retraction really vindicate those with a right-leaning view in Japan? They've always said that the military didn't go out and forcibly recruit women. There was no really coercion involved.
Of course this does. That was obviously something that probably held the Asahi back from ever doing this, because the last thing they wanted was to give the revisionist right wing its big prize. Ha ha, we were right. You see, we were right after all. The issue of coercion for the right is paramount for some reason, whether it's because they really do believe that it's an insult to the honor of the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, when so many things that they did were so dishonorable. I don't see why they would be going on this one particular element of the behavior of the imperial forces prior to 1945, but they seem to have gone overboard on the idea that we don't do roundups of women. Well, they did in the prisoner of war camps holding Dutch prisoners of war in Indonesia. That was documented, and for that, the Dutch government in the 1990s and up into the millennial years worked with what was called here in Japan the Asian Women's Fund to identify and find people who had been taken physically from the prisoner of war camps to serve as sexual slaves within this system of institutionalized prostitution.
Well, that's the other question. Just because the coercion element has been, I guess in some ways, proven false by the retraction of Yoshida's statement, does it negate the comfort women issue itself?
Not at all. The comfort women issue is a rather perverse outgrowth of the attempt to control the trafficking of women and children. In 1925, Japan acceded to the International Convention on the Suppression of Trafficking of Women and Children. But like many imperial powers at the time, Great Britain, for example, and France, it chose to exempt from that treaty areas that were either colonies or areas under their administration that weren't a part of the national territory. In Japan's case, they chose to exempt the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, Pacific territories that it controlled, and the leased territory of Guangdong and half of Sakhalin Island. These areas, the trafficking of women was kept open and legal. And perversely, it was because of this treaty, which the Europeans had created in order to prevent women of European origins ending up in brothels around the world. By signing this treaty and exempting its colonial possessions, it created an incentive and indeed eventually a system whereby women in colonial areas were shipped to the front lines, which, while sending women from Japan proper, would have been illegal and was illegal.
Let's take a look to the future. The United States has just met with some comfort women. Several bodies from the United Nations have really come down hard on Japan, even going as far as to say that instead of comfort women, the term enforced sex slaves needs to be used. Where do you see the Japanese government moving in the future based on these events?
The Japanese government would wish that the whole issue would go away. And in terms of the lifespans of persons who can do direct claims, that's true. It will go away and go away soon. The surviving women are quite old and are not going to be around for very much longer. And after the actual victims are there, who's there to apologize to officially? So there's a clock element in this that is in the favor of the Japanese government stalling. Nevertheless, Abe Shinzo recognizes that his values and his history have isolated him within Northeast Asia at a time when his country really needs to get on a firmer footing with South Korea in regards to the greater threat to everyone, which is the expansion of China and China's military capabilities. There really has to be something between South Korea and Japan, and currently there is nothing. The South Korean side and the Japanese side cannot meet unless President Obama is literally sitting between the two leaders and holding both of their hands. That has to change. There is in Japan's interest a closer relationship, security relationship with South Korea. And that's primarily because the United States demands it of Japan and is pushing Japan all the time. When are you going to get on better relations with South Korea? Because we want that. It's the number one item on the U.S. agenda, the security agenda with Japan, according to my sources in Washington. That's what they want to hear from Japan. And Mr. Abe has to have an answer to that question. And currently, if he sticks with his ideology, he will not have an answer to that question.
I'd like to thank Michael Cucek for joining me today, but let's not let the conversation end there. Does the retraction of the Asahi Shimbun articles negate all claims that Japan used women as sexual slaves during World War II? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the issue, so please leave a comment on our page, on our website, on Facebook, or through Twitter. Now, if you haven't connected with us on Facebook, that address is facebook.com/AsiaNewsWeekly, or you can find us on Twitter at Asian News Weekly. Also, if you have any comments or feedback about the show, or you would like to email us, just drop a line to this address. It's asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. If you would like more information on the background for this podcast, please visit Asian News Weekly for the show notes. There you'll also be able to find a link to Michael Cucek's blog. Don't forget you can also download each one of our shows from our website, iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. And if you really enjoy this episode, I hope you'll take a moment and share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. And when you subscribe to a podcast, it's delivered instantaneously to your mobile device or your desktop as soon as the next episode drops. And if you use iTunes or Stitcher, I hope you can do me a huge favor and rate and review the podcast. It's how podcasts get featured, and it would mean so much to me. I'm going on a mini vacation, so there won't be an Asia Now this upcoming Wednesday, but I'll be back next week with full episodes. That's it for today, my friends. Thank you so much for listening. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.